Do you remember your grandmother leaving the Thanksgiving turkey on the counter for 3 hours, thawing meat on the kitchen table all afternoon? Welcome home. You lived through the 1960s when food safety didn't exist in home kitchens, but when you grew up, everything changed.
Water boiling, ready for the cereal. Bacon sizzling, bread toasting.
So let's discover these 30 dangerous cooking habits grandparents still swear by today. The 1965 habit of leaving cooked food out overnight to cool wasn't negligence. It was what every grandmother did with hot soup, roast chicken, or pot roast, setting the pot on the counter at 9 p.m. after dinner and leaving it there until morning, because putting hot food directly in the refrigerator would warm up everything else and spoil the milk. Kansas kitchens had pots of chicken soup sitting on counters overnight, cooling slowly through the danger zone between 40-degree Kelvin and 140-degree Kelvin, where bacteria multiply fastest. This habit required no refrigerator space, saved electricity, and the belief that food needed to cool to room temperature before refrigeration. You couldn't put hot food in the fridge. Grandma said it would break the refrigerator motor. You couldn't worry about bacteria. Nobody knew about the danger zone. The 1963 habit of washing raw chicken in the sink wasn't carelessness. It was what every grandmother did, running cold water over the chicken to clean it before cooking, splashing chicken juice and bacteria all over the sink, faucet, and counter. Detroit kitchens had grandmothers holding whole chickens under running water, rinsing the cavity, and believing this made the chicken cleaner and safer to cook. This habit required only a sink and cold water, and the belief that raw chicken needed washing before cooking. You couldn't skip rinsing. Grandma said it removed slime and made the chicken clean. You couldn't see the bacteria spreading. What it meant, washing chicken was hygiene, not contamination. Modern food safety explicitly says never wash raw chicken because water spray aerosolizes bacteria like Salmonella and Campylobacter, spreading them up to 3 feet from the sink onto counters, dishes, and other foods. Cooking to 165 degrees kills bacteria. Washing doesn't. But grandparents still rinse chicken today and argue that they've been doing it for 60 years without getting sick, even though CDC estimates 1 million people get sick from chicken annually. The 1966 habit of using the same cutting board for raw meat and vegetables wasn't laziness, it was efficiency. When kitchens had one wooden cutting board that was used for everything throughout the day without washing between uses. Boston kitchens had grandmothers cutting raw chicken on the wooden board, wiping it with a damp cloth, and immediately chopping vegetables for salad on the same surface. This habit required only one cutting board, saved time, and the belief that wiping the board was sufficient cleaning. You couldn't own multiple boards. One was standard. You couldn't see cross-contamination happening. What it meant, one board for everything was normal kitchen practice. Modern food safety requires separate cutting boards for raw meat and ready-to-eat foods, or thorough washing with hot soapy water between uses. Cross-contamination transfers bacteria from raw meat to vegetables that won't be cooked. The 1964 habit of tasting raw cookie dough with raw eggs wasn't risky behavior. It was the best part of baking when grandmothers made chocolate chip cookies and everyone got a spoonful of dough before it went in the oven. Milwaukee kitchens had grandmothers handing wooden spoons coated in raw dough containing raw eggs and raw flour to grandchildren who licked them clean. This habit required no concern about raw eggs or raw flour, and the belief that cookie dough was harmless and delicious. You couldn't skip tasting. It was tradition and quality control. You couldn't worry about salmonella from eggs or E. coli from flour. What it meant, raw cookie dough was a treat, not a hazard. Modern food safety warns against eating raw cookie dough due to salmonella risk from raw eggs, 1 in 20,000 eggs contaminated, and E. coli risk from raw flour. The 1965 habit of thawing meat on the counter all day wasn't poor planning. It was standard procedure when grandmothers took frozen meat out of the freezer at 8 a.m. and left it sitting on the kitchen counter until 5 p.m. when it was thawed enough to cook for dinner. Philadelphia kitchens had frozen chickens, roasts, and ground beef sitting at room temperature for 8 to 10 hours, slowly thawing. This habit required no advance planning beyond morning removal from freezer and the belief that countertop thawing was the normal way to defrost meat. You couldn't thaw in refrigerator. Took too long. You couldn't use cold water method. Nobody did that. What it meant, countertop thawing was how everyone defrosted meat. Modern food safety says meat should never thaw at room temperature because the outer surface reaches danger zone temperatures, above 40 degrees, long before the inside thaws, allowing bacteria to multiply. Safe methods are refrigerator thawing, cold water thawing, or microwave thawing. But grandparents still put frozen meat on the counter at breakfast and cook it at dinner, insisting, "We always did it this way, and nobody died." Dangerous habits down. And you're already remembering how your grandmother's kitchen operated by completely different rules than food safety experts recommend today. She left food out, washed chicken, used one cutting board for everything, and never worried about bacteria she couldn't see. The 1963 habit of never sanitizing wooden cutting boards wasn't neglect. It was standard practice when wooden boards were washed with cold or warm water, maybe some soap, and hung to dry without ever being sanitized or bleached. Seattle kitchens had wooden cutting boards that were decades old, deeply grooved from knife cuts, washed casually, and used daily for raw meat and vegetables. This habit required only a quick wash after use, and the belief that wooden boards didn't need sanitizing because wood was naturally antibacterial. You couldn't bleach wood. Grandma said it would damage the board. You couldn't worry about bacteria in the grooves. What it meant, wooden boards just needed washing, not sanitizing. Modern food safety recommends sanitizing cutting boards, especially after raw meat, with diluted bleach solution. 1 tablespoon bleach per gallon water, because knife grooves harbor bacteria that soap and water don't remove. Research shows wooden boards can be sanitary if properly maintained, but deep grooves make them impossible to sanitize. But grandparents still use the same wooden boards from 1960 with deep grooves and insist they're fine because wood is naturally antibacterial. The 1966 habit of storing leftovers in open tin cans wasn't laziness, it was efficiency. When grandmothers opened a can of tomatoes or beans, used half, and put the opened can with remaining contents directly in the refrigerator, still in the original can. Chicago refrigerators had multiple opened tin cans, storing leftover canned goods for days. This habit required no extra storage containers, saved dishes, and the belief that tin cans were fine for storage once opened. You couldn't transfer to another container. That made extra dishes. You couldn't worry about metal leaching. What it meant, opened cans were storage containers. Modern food safety recommends transferring opened canned goods to glass or plastic containers because once a can is opened, the tin and iron can dissolve into acidic foods, giving them a metallic taste and potentially allowing more bacteria growth. While not acutely dangerous, it's not recommended. But grandparents still store opened cans in the fridge and insist, "We've done it forever and it's fine," even though the metallic taste proves metal is leaching. The 1965 habit of eating raw hamburger wasn't exotic. It was a Wisconsin and German-American tradition where fresh ground raw beef was spread on rye bread with raw onions and called cannibal sandwiches or tiger meat, served at holidays and parties. Milwaukee homes had platters of raw ground beef at Christmas parties that guests spread on crackers and ate completely raw. This habit required freshly ground beef from a trusted butcher, and the belief that very fresh raw beef was safe to eat if ground that day. You couldn't use old beef, had to be fresh ground. You couldn't worry about E. coli that wasn't widely known yet. What it meant, raw beef was a delicacy, not a danger. Modern food safety explicitly warns against eating raw or underground beef due to E. coli O157H7, which can cause kidney failure and death, especially in children and elderly. USDA recommends cooking ground beef to 160 degrees internal temperature. But Wisconsin grandparents still serve cannibal sandwiches at Christmas and insist, "We've eaten it every year since 1940 and nobody got sick." The 1964 habit of reusing cooking oil multiple times until it was black wasn't frugality gone wrong. It was standard practice when grandmothers kept a can of frying oil on the stove, used it to fry chicken on Sunday, strained it through cheesecloth, and reused it for weeks until the oil turned dark brown or black. Southern kitchens had coffee cans of used frying oil sitting on stovetops for weeks, getting darker with each use. This habit required only a strainer and storage can, saved money when oil was expensive, and the belief that strained oil was fine to reuse indefinitely. You couldn't throw away oil after one use. That was wasteful. You couldn't worry about oil breaking down. What it meant, oil was reused until it was obviously bad. Modern food safety says cooking oil breaks down with use, creating harmful compounds, off flavors, and lower smoke points. Repeatedly heated oil oxidizes and creates free radicals. Dark color indicates breakdown, and oil should be discarded. But grandparents still reuse oil many times and insist, "We always did it, and it tastes fine," even though degraded oil contains compounds linked to health problems. The 1966 habit of leaving mayonnaise-based salads out at picnics for hours wasn't carelessness. It was normal when potato salad, coleslaw, and macaroni salad sat on picnic tables in summer heat from noon until evening while families ate, played, and returned for seconds and thirds hours later. Ohio picnics had bowls of potato salad with mayonnaise sitting in 85-degree heat for 4–6 hours. This habit required no coolers or ice, and the belief that mayonnaise-based salads were fine at room temperature for extended periods. You couldn't pack everything on ice. Nobody did that. You couldn't worry about bacteria multiplying. Nobody knew what it meant. Picnic food sat out all day, and everyone ate it. Modern food safety says mayonnaise-based salads in the danger zone, above 40 degrees, for more than 2 hours, allow rapid bacterial growth causing food poisoning. While commercial mayonnaise is acidic and somewhat protective, the other ingredients, potatoes, eggs, pasta, are high risk. But grandparents still leave potato salad out all afternoon at picnics and insist, "We never got sick," even though summer picnics are a leading source of foodborne illness. The 1963 habit of drinking unpasteurized raw milk straight from the cow wasn't living dangerously. It was daily life on farms where milk went from cow to bucket to pitcher to table without pasteurization, and children drank warm raw milk within hours of milking. Rural Wisconsin farms had families drinking raw milk 3 times a day without ever considering pasteurization. This habit required only access to a family cow or local dairy farmer, and the belief that raw milk was more nutritious and natural than pasteurized milk. You couldn't pasteurize at home easily. You couldn't worry about bacteria. Milk came from your own cow. What it meant, raw milk was normal farm milk, not a health risk. Modern food safety says raw milk can contain dangerous bacteria, including Salmonella, E. coli, Listeria, and Campylobacter, causing serious illness, especially in children, elderly, and pregnant women. CDC and FDA recommend only pasteurized milk, but grandparents who grew up on farms still seek out raw milk and insist, "We drank it every day and we were healthier," even though raw milk causes outbreaks regularly. The 1965 habit of eating cookie dough with raw flour wasn't just about raw eggs. It included raw flour, which nobody considered dangerous until recent E. coli outbreaks showed that flour itself can harbor bacteria. Denver kitchens had grandchildren eating spoonfuls of cookie dough made with raw flour and raw eggs without any concern about either ingredient. This habit required no knowledge that flour could carry E. coli from grain contamination, and the belief that flour was sterile and harmless in its raw form. You couldn't imagine flour being dangerous. It looked so clean and white. You couldn't skip tasting dough. It was tradition. What it meant, flour was considered completely safe raw. Modern food safety says raw flour can contain E. coli from field contamination because flour isn't treated to kill bacteria. Multiple outbreaks since 2016 traced to raw flour in cookie dough and cake batter. Heat-treated flour is now available for safe raw consumption. But grandparents still use regular flour in cookie dough and insist the risk is overblown because we ate it for decades. The 1964 habit of never using a meat thermometer wasn't skipping equipment. It was the standard method where grandmothers judged meat doneness by appearance, texture, juice color, and decades of experience without ever measuring internal temperature. Texas kitchens had grandmothers cooking roasts, chickens, and pork chops without owning a meat thermometer, using only visual and tactile cues. This habit required years of cooking experience and confidence in sensory evaluation instead of temperature measurement. You couldn't rely on a thermometer. Only fancy cooks had those. You couldn't worry about exact temperatures. You knew by looking. What it meant, experience and eyeballing determined doneness, not numbers. Modern food safety provides specific internal temperatures for safety. 165-degree Vias for poultry, 145-degree Vias for whole cuts of beef, pork, 160-degree Vias for ground meat. Appearance alone isn't reliable. Research shows color isn't accurate indicator of safety. The 1966 habit of storing eggs unrefrigerated on the counter wasn't negligence. It was standard practice in many households where eggs from local farms or even supermarkets were kept in a bowl on the kitchen counter for weeks without refrigeration. British and European immigrant households especially stored eggs at room temperature because that was normal in their home countries. This habit required only counter space and the belief that eggs didn't need refrigeration if they weren't washed. You couldn't waste refrigerator space on eggs. You couldn't worry about them spoiling. They had shells protecting them. What it meant, room temperature egg storage was completely normal. Modern U.S. food safety recommends refrigerating eggs because U.S. commercial eggs are washed, removing protective coating, and refrigeration prevents salmonella growth. In Europe, unwashed eggs can be stored at room temperature, but in the U.S., washed eggs should be refrigerated. Many grandparents still keep eggs on the counter and insist they're fine for weeks, even though U.S. eggs are washed and more vulnerable to bacteria at room temperature. The 1965 habit of making homemade mayonnaise with raw eggs wasn't risky behavior. It was standard cooking when grandmothers whisked raw egg yolks with oil and vinegar or lemon juice to make fresh mayonnaise that was used immediately or stored in the refrigerator for days without concern about salmonella contamination. French-descended and Southern kitchens made homemade mayonnaise regularly with raw eggs from their own backyard chickens or from the grocery store, believing that fresh eggs meant safe eggs. The sound was the steady whisk of egg yolks being beaten while oil was dripped in slowly until the mixture emulsified into thick, pale yellow mayonnaise. The smell was neutral eggs, bright lemon juice or sharp vinegar, and the clean scent of vegetable oil combining. The taste was rich, tangy, fresh mayonnaise that tasted completely different from store-bought jarred versions, more eggy, more lemony, more alive. This habit required only eggs, oil, and acid, lemon or vinegar, a bowl, a whisk, and the belief that fresh homemade mayonnaise was superior to jarred mayonnaise and perfectly safe to make and consume. You couldn't buy mayonnaise when homemade was so much better and fresher. You couldn't worry about raw eggs. That's how mayonnaise had been made for centuries. What it meant, homemade mayonnaise with raw eggs, was normal cooking, a basic culinary skill, not a dangerous practice requiring warnings. Modern food safety warns that raw eggs can contain Salmonella enteritis, and mayonnaise made with raw eggs should be consumed immediately and kept refrigerated, though the acid in mayonnaise provides some protection. Commercial mayonnaise uses pasteurized eggs, which are heat-treated to kill bacteria. Risk is relatively low, but exists, especially for vulnerable populations. But grandparents still make mayonnaise with raw eggs from the grocery store and insist, "We've made it this way forever and never got sick," even though salmonella from raw eggs causes thousands of illnesses yearly. The 1963 habit of canning low-acid foods in water bath. Canners instead of pressure canners wasn't ignorance. It was what grandmothers did before pressure canners were common, affordable, or understood, processing green beans, corn, carrots, and even meat in boiling water baths for extended time, sometimes 3+ hours, instead of pressure canning at the required 240 degrees temperature. Rural kitchens across America canned jars of vegetables in large pots of boiling water on stovetops and hoped the extended boiling time was sufficient to kill everything dangerous, not understanding that botulism spores survive boiling temperatures. The sound was jars rattling in boiling water for hours. The smell was vegetables cooking and the steam filling the kitchen. The appearance was beautiful jars of green beans and corn lined up on pantry shelves, looking safe but potentially harboring botulism spores. This habit required only a large pot for water bath canning, and the belief that long boiling time, sometimes doubling or tripling the time to be extra safe, killed everything dangerous, including botulism. You couldn't afford a pressure canner. They were expensive equipment that cost as much as a month's groceries. You couldn't worry about botulism. That was something rare that happened to other people. What it meant, water bath canning was used for everything, not just high-acid foods like tomatoes and fruits. Modern food safety requires pressure canning for low-acid foods, vegetables, meat, beans, corn, because Clostridium botulinum spores survive boiling water temperature, 212 degrees Fahrenheit, but are killed at pressure canning temperature, 240 degrees Celsius, achieved at 10 to 15 psi. Botulism is deadly. Even a small taste can cause paralysis and death. USDA explicitly forbids water bath canning low-acid foods under any circumstances, but some grandparents in rural areas still water bath green beans using extended processing times and insist, "We always did it this way for 50 years, and nobody ever got botulism," not understanding that botulism is rare, but the risk is real, and that modern pressure canning guidelines exist because people died. The 1965 habit of tasting canning liquid to check if it was done wasn't reckless. It was quality control when grandmothers would open freshly processed canning jars while still hot, dip a spoon into the liquid or pull out a piece of the canned food, taste it to determine if the seasoning was correct, and decide if it needed adjustment or reprocessing. Ohio kitchens had grandmothers tasting hot canning liquid from jars that had just come out of the canner, checking salt levels, sweetness, and overall flavor before deciding whether to seal the jars for storage or reprocess with adjusted seasoning. The sound was the pop of a jar lid being pried open while still hot. The smell was the concentrated aroma of whatever had been canned: pickles, tomatoes, green beans, steaming from the opened jar. The taste was a spoonful of hot canning liquid being blown on to cool it slightly before tasting. This habit required confidence in the canning process and the belief that tasting was necessary for quality assurance, because you couldn't know if the recipe worked or if you'd added enough salt or sugar without tasting it first. You couldn't trust that following a recipe would produce the right flavor, had to taste and confirm. You couldn't worry about contamination or underprocessing. The taste test for seasoning came before concerns about safety. What it meant, tasting from canning jars immediately after processing, was normal quality control, standard practice for experienced canners who wanted to ensure their preserved food tasted good. Modern food safety says never taste home-canned foods before storage to check for spoilage or quality, because botulism toxin has no taste, no smell, and no visible appearance. And tasting food contaminated with botulism toxin can cause death even from a small taste. You cannot detect botulism by taste or smell. It's completely imperceptible until symptoms appear. But some grandparents still taste from canning jars immediately after processing to check seasoning levels, not understanding that if botulism spores survived processing, the toxin that develops during storage is deadly and undetectable, and that quality checking should happen during preparation, not after canning. The 1966 habit of keeping Thanksgiving turkey out for hours before carving wasn't poor timing or laziness. It was cherished tradition when the turkey came out of the oven, golden and beautiful at 1 p.m., sat on the counter as a centerpiece while the family gathered and took photos, remained there during appetizers and pre-dinner socializing, got carved ceremonially at 3 p.m. with everyone watching, and sat on the serving platter on the dining room table until 5 p.m. or later, when people came back for second and third helpings, spending 4 or more hours at room temperature in the danger zone. Pennsylvania. Thanksgiving dinners had turkey sitting out all afternoon while family arrived, ate, talked, and returned to pick at the carcass for hours. This habit required no rush to refrigerate turkey after cooking, and the belief that cooked turkey was shelf-stable for hours at room temperature because it was fully cooked and hot from the oven. You couldn't carve the turkey immediately when it came out. You needed time for photos with the golden bird, for latecomers to arrive, for side dishes to finish cooking. You couldn't refrigerate it mid-meal. People were still eating from it, and there wasn't room in the refrigerator anyway with all the side dishes. What it meant, holiday turkey sat out all day as the centerpiece of celebration, and everyone picked at it for hours, and that was normal and expected and part of the tradition. Modern food safety says cooked turkey shouldn't sit at room temperature for more than 2 hours total because bacteria multiply rapidly in the danger zone between 40-degree calm and 140-degree calf. Large turkeys cool slowly, keeping the interior warm while the surface reaches room temperature, creating ideal conditions for bacterial growth. USDA recommends carving turkey and refrigerating it within 2 hours of coming out of the oven, but families still follow grandparents' tradition of all-day turkey on the counter, taking the turkey out at 1 p.m. and eating from it until evening, and they insist, "We've done it every Thanksgiving for 50 years, and nobody ever got sick." The 1964 habit of using cracked or chipped dishes wasn't being cheap or refusing to buy new things. It was normal when favorite plates, bowls, and cups developed cracks in the glaze and chips on the edges over decades of use, but were still used daily for meals because dishes were expensive investments and throwing them away for minor cosmetic damage seemed wasteful when they still functioned perfectly well for holding food. Michigan kitchens had complete dish sets from the 1940s with visible cracks running through the glaze, chips missing from plate edges and bowl rims, and crazing fine crack networks covering the surface, all still in daily rotation for family meals. The sound was dishes clinking together in the cupboard, some with chips that made them stack unevenly. The appearance was dishes with visible damage, cracks you could see and feel with your finger, chips exposing the clay body underneath the glaze and crazing that collected stains over time, making the dishes look dingy. This habit required only tolerance for imperfect dishes and the belief that cracks and chips were purely cosmetic issues that didn't affect food safety or the dish's ability to function. You couldn't throw away dishes just because they developed cracks. That was wasteful when dishes were expensive and these still held food. You couldn't afford to replace entire dish sets regularly when budgets were tight and dishes lasted for decades. What it meant, dishes were used until they broke completely into pieces, not when they developed cracks or chips that seemed like minor damage. Modern food safety warns that cracks and chips in dishes create crevices where bacteria can hide and survive normal washing, especially cracks in the glaze where moisture and food particles penetrate into the porous clay body underneath. Bacteria colonize these cracks and can transfer to food. Dishes with cracks, chips, or crazing should be discarded for food safety. But grandparents still use the same cracked and chipped dishes from 1960, washing them in the dishwasher or by hand, and insist, "We wash them thoroughly with hot soapy water, and they're perfectly fine. We've used them for 60 years." The 1965 habit of stuffing turkey instead of cooking dressing separately wasn't just tradition, it was the only authentic way people made dressing, believing that real stuffing had to be cooked inside the turkey cavity, where it would absorb the turkey juices and develop flavor that separately cooked dressing could never achieve. Grandmothers packed the turkey cavity completely full of bread stuffing mixture, sometimes even sewing the cavity shut or securing it with skewers, and roasted it inside the turkey where the stuffing cooked slowly in the danger zone for hours. Texas. Thanksgiving dinners featured turkeys stuffed so full that stuffing bulged out of both cavities, spending 4 to 5 hours in the oven with the stuffing center remaining at unsafe temperatures for extended periods while the outer turkey cooked. The sound was stuffing being spooned into the turkey cavity until packed tight. The smell was bread, sage, onions, and celery mixed with raw turkey as it was stuffed. The taste was stuffing that absorbed turkey drippings and fat, creating rich, savory flavor. This habit required stuffing the turkey the night before or the morning of cooking, and the absolute belief that stuffing cooked inside the turkey tasted fundamentally better than dressing cooked separately in a pan. You couldn't cook dressing in a pan alongside the turkey. That was dressing, not stuffing, and it was inferior because it didn't absorb the turkey juices. You couldn't worry about whether the stuffing center reached safe temperature. The turkey looked done, so the stuffing must be done. What it meant, real, authentic, traditional stuffing was cooked inside the turkey cavity, and cooking it separately was a shortcut that produced inferior results. Modern food safety warns that stuffing inside turkey is high risk because the stuffing center must reach 165 degrees, while the turkey breast also reaches 165 degrees, and often the turkey is fully cooked and beginning to dry out before the stuffing center is safe. Raw turkey juices contaminate the stuffing, and the stuffing acts as insulation, keeping its center cool longer. USDA strongly recommends cooking dressing separately in a casserole dish, but grandparents still stuff the turkey completely full and insist it's not the same when cooked separately. You lose the authentic flavor, consciously accepting the risk for the sake of tradition and taste. 20 dangerous habits down, and you're realizing food safety in the 1960s was based on experience and tradition, not science. Grandparents survived these practices and concluded they were safe, not understanding that many people did get sick but didn't connect illness to cooking habits. The 1963 habit of licking the beaters with raw cake batter wasn't risky behavior. It was the reward for helping bake when children would fight over who got to lick the electric mixer beaters coated in raw batter containing raw eggs and raw flour. Oregon kitchens had grandmothers pulling the beaters from the mixer and handing them directly to grandchildren who licked them clean, while grandma scraped the bowl with a rubber spatula and gave that to the next child in line. The sound was the electric mixer stopping, the beaters being pulled out with batter dripping, and children arguing over who helped more and deserved the beaters. The smell was sweet vanilla cake batter, and the taste was raw sugar, butter, eggs, flour, and vanilla, a combination that tasted better raw than baked, according to every child who ever licked a beater. This habit required no concern about raw ingredients, and the belief that cake batter was a harmless treat that had been enjoyed by generations. You couldn't waste batter by not licking the beaters. That was the best part of baking and the reason children agreed to help. You couldn't worry about salmonella from eggs or E. coli from flour. Nobody knew those risks existed in home baking. What it meant, licking the beaters was tradition and privilege, a childhood rite of passage, not a health risk that needed warnings. Modern food safety warns against consuming raw batter due to both raw eggs, salmonella risk from contamination, approximately 1 in 20,000 eggs, and raw flour, E. coli risk from field contamination. Multiple outbreaks since 2016 linked to raw flour consumption. CDC explicitly warns against eating raw batter or dough, but grandparents still let grandchildren lick beaters and insist, "We all did it and we're fine," maintaining a tradition despite warnings and pointing out that they licked beaters for 60 years without getting sick, which they believe proves the risk is exaggerated. The 1966 habit of never washing hands between handling raw meat and other food wasn't laziness. It was efficiency when grandmothers were preparing dinner, handled raw chicken to season it and put it in the roasting pan, wiped their hands on the apron tied around their waist, and immediately started chopping vegetables for salad without washing hands with soap and water between tasks. Alabama kitchens had grandmothers moving seamlessly from raw meat to ready-to-eat foods with only an apron wipe between, believing that the apron removed enough residue to continue cooking. The sound was the efficient rhythm of meal preparation without interruption, chicken in pan, hands wiped on apron, knife on cutting board, chopping lettuce and tomato. The texture was hands that felt slightly slippery from chicken fat being wiped on cotton apron fabric that absorbed some moisture but left hands still contaminated with invisible bacteria. This habit required only an apron for hand wiping, and the belief that hands didn't need washing between different food preparation tasks because visible cleanliness equaled actual cleanliness. You couldn't stop and wash hands multiple times during meal prep. That interrupted workflow and added unnecessary time to dinner preparation. You couldn't see bacteria transferring from hands to vegetables, so there was no evidence that the practice was dangerous. What it meant, one hand washing per meal prep session was standard. Hands were washed before starting to cook and after finishing, but not between different tasks during cooking. Modern food safety requires washing hands with soap and warm water for at least 20 seconds after handling raw meat and before touching anything else, especially ready-to-eat foods, to prevent cross-contamination of pathogens like salmonella and Campylobacter. Apron wiping spreads bacteria instead of removing them, and the bacteria remain viable on hands. But grandparents still wipe hands on aprons between tasks and insist, "I never washed hands that often and nobody got sick," not understanding that cross-contamination is invisible and that mild food poisoning symptoms are often attributed to other causes. The 1964 habit of using aluminum foil to cover acidic foods in storage wasn't a mistake. It was standard practice when grandmothers covered bowls of tomato sauce, lemon desserts, marinated meats, or anything with vinegar directly with aluminum foil and refrigerated them for days without knowing that acid reacts with aluminum. New York kitchens had bowls of spaghetti sauce covered directly with aluminum foil for multiple days in the refrigerator, and the foil would develop gray spots where the acid had corroded the aluminum. But nobody connected the metallic taste in reheated sauce to the foil covering. The sound was the crinkle of foil being torn from the roll and pressed over bowl edges. The smell was tomato sauce that gradually developed a slightly metallic undertone after a day or two covered in foil. The appearance was sauce that sometimes had gray disc. You couldn't use plastic wrap. It wasn't widely available or affordable in the early 1960s. You couldn't use wax paper. It didn't seal well over bowls. You couldn't know that acid reacted chemically with aluminum because that information wasn't common knowledge. What it meant, foil was the universal food covering for everything in the refrigerator, regardless of food type, and the convenience outweighed any concerns about interaction between foil and food. Modern food safety warns that acidic foods, tomatoes, citrus, vinegar, wine-based sauces, react with aluminum, causing aluminum to leach into food, creating off flavors, metallic taste, and gray discoloration, and potentially exposing people to excessive dietary aluminum. Use glass containers, plastic wrap, wax paper, or parchment paper for acidic foods instead of aluminum foil. But grandparents still cover tomato sauce with foil and insist, "We've done it forever," not noticing or not caring about the metallic taste or gray color that indicates aluminum has leached into their food. The 1965 habit of keeping bacon grease in a can on the stove for weeks wasn't laziness or ignorance. It was resourcefulness when grandmothers kept a coffee can or metal container next to the stove, poured hot bacon grease into it after cooking bacon for breakfast, and used it for weeks to fry eggs, cook potatoes, and add flavor to vegetables without refrigerating it between uses. Kentucky kitchens had cans of bacon grease sitting at room temperature on stovetops for weeks or months, accumulating more grease with each bacon breakfast and being used multiple times daily. The sound was the sizzle of bacon grease being added to a hot pan for frying eggs. The smell was porky, smoky bacon fat that intensified as it aged and concentrated. The appearance was white or pale yellow, solid fat at room temperature that melted to clear liquid when heated, sometimes with brown bits of bacon sediment at the bottom. This habit required only a can for grease storage, usually an old coffee can, and the belief that animal fat was shelf-stable at room temperature indefinitely because fat doesn't spoil like meat or dairy. You couldn't refrigerate grease. It would solidify into a hard block that was difficult to scoop out for cooking. You couldn't throw away grease after one use. That was wasteful when it could be reused for flavoring. What it meant, the bacon grease can on the stove was a permanent kitchen fixture, like the salt shaker or the coffee pot, used daily and rarely emptied completely. Modern food safety says bacon grease should be strained and refrigerated after initial use because small bits of meat and moisture remaining in the fat can grow bacteria or go rancid at room temperature over time, especially in warm kitchens. Refrigerated in an airtight container, bacon grease lasts months At room temperature, it can develop off flavors from oxidation and potentially bacterial growth, but grandparents still keep grease at room temperature on the stove in open or loosely covered cans and insist valuing convenience and tradition over refrigeration guidelines. The 1963 habit of eating raw oysters from questionable sources wasn't adventurous eating. It was normal when oysters were bought from roadside stands without refrigeration, dug from local waters without checking water quality, or purchased without concern about harvesting location, water temperature, or Vibrio bacteria that thrives in warm coastal waters. Louisiana and coastal Virginia had people eating raw oysters from unknown waters year-round without asking about harvest dates, locations, or safety certifications. Modern food safety warns that raw oysters from warm waters, Gulf Coast especially, can contain Vibrio vulnificus bacteria that causes severe illness. Oysters should be from certified safe waters, consumed only in cold months, and people with health conditions should avoid raw oysters entirely. I've eaten them all my life from anywhere, not understanding that Vibrio risk has increased with warming ocean temperatures. The 1966 habit of serving rare hamburgers with pink centers wasn't gourmet cooking or preference. It was normal when many families cooked hamburgers like steaks, leaving them rare or medium rare in the center because overcooking made them dry and tough. California backyard barbecues served hamburgers with visible pink centers just like rare steaks without understanding that grinding meat creates different bacterial risks. The sound was hamburgers sizzling on the grill being flipped once after a few minutes per side, pulled off while still soft and pink inside. The smell was charred burger exterior with juicy, barely cooked interior. The taste was beefy, juicy, tender burger that hadn't been cooked long enough to dry out. The texture was firm exterior with soft, pink, warm, not hot center that was considered perfectly cooked. This habit required only the belief that hamburgers were like steaks and should be cooked to preference, rare, medium, or well done, based on personal taste. You couldn't overcook burgers to gray throughout. That made them dry, tough, and less flavorful. You couldn't worry about the pink center. That was the sign of a properly juicy burger that hadn't been ruined by overcooking. What it meant, pink hamburgers were properly cooked hamburgers, not undercooked, and cooking them until gray throughout was considered bad cooking that destroyed the meat. The 1964 habit of using honey in baby food before age 1 wasn't dangerous parenting. It was common practice when grandmothers added honey to pacifiers, homemade baby formula, or infant cereal to sweeten it for fussy babies, believing that honey was the purest, most natural sweetener and therefore the healthiest option for babies. Tennessee grandmothers dipped pacifiers in honey and gave them to 6-month-old babies to soothe them during teething, and no pediatricians warned against it because infant botulism wasn't widely understood yet. The sound was a baby sucking contentedly on a honey-coated pacifier. The smell was sweet floral honey. The taste, for babies, was intensely sweet, which made them stop crying and accept the pacifier or bottle they'd been refusing. The texture was sticky honey coating the pacifier or mixed into thin baby cereal. This habit required only honey from the pantry, and the belief that honey was natural, pure, medicinal, and safe for everyone, including young infants, because it came from bees, not factories. You couldn't know about infant botulism spores in honey because that connection wasn't established until the 1970s. You couldn't imagine that honey, which was used in home remedies and considered healthy, could be dangerous for babies. What it meant, honey was considered the healthiest sweetener for babies, superior to refined white sugar, and grandmothers who used it believed they were making better choices than mothers who used commercial sweetened baby food. Modern food safety warns to never give honey to infants under 12 months old because honey can contain Clostridium botulinum spores that cause infant botulism, a rare but potentially fatal paralytic illness. Adult and older children's digestive systems handle the spores safely, but infant digestive systems lack the acidity and competing bacteria to prevent spores from germinating and producing toxin. The 1965 habit of keeping moldy cheese and just cutting off the mold wasn't being cheap or refusing to waste food irrationally. It was practical thrift and common sense when grandmothers found mold growing on a block of cheddar cheese that cost significant money, carefully cut off the moldy part with what they considered a generous safety margin, usually a quarter-inch to half-inch, and confidently used the rest of the cheese without any concern that mold had invisible root structures called hyphae penetrating deeper into the cheese than the visible surface mold they could see with their eyes. Vermont refrigerators had blocks of sharp cheddar with small mold spots that were routinely trimmed off with a paring knife, and the remaining cheese was grated for macaroni and cheese casseroles, or sliced for grilled cheese sandwiches, without anyone thinking twice about whether it was safe. The sound was the sharp knife sawing through firm, cold cheese to remove the moldy section in one clean cut. The smell was sharp-aged cheddar mixed with the distinctive musty, earthy smell of surface mold that hadn't penetrated far. The appearance was white, green, or black mold spots on the cheese surface being cut away cleanly to reveal what looked like perfectly clean, normal cheese underneath, with no visible signs of contamination. This habit required only a sharp knife to cut away. The smell was sharp-aged cheddar mixed with the distinctive musty, earthy smell of surface mold that hadn't penetrated far. The appearance was white, green, or black mold spots on the cheese surface being cut away cleanly to reveal what looked like perfectly clean, normal cheese underneath, with no visible signs of contamination. This habit required only a sharp knife to cut away visible mold and the deeply held belief that mold was only present where you could actually see it growing, similar to a bruise on an apple that could be cut around to salvage the rest of the fruit. You couldn't throw away an entire block of expensive cheese that cost $1 or more just because of a small mold spot. That was unconscionable waste when family budgets were tight and cheese was considered a luxury item, not an everyday staple. What it meant: visible mold could be cut away with a small margin that seemed generous. The rest of the cheese was perfectly fine and completely safe to eat because mold was understood as a surface problem similar to bread mold, not an internal contamination that might have spread throughout the food invisibly. Modern food safety guidelines say that hard cheeses like cheddar, Swiss, and Parmesan can have moldy parts safely cut off with a 1-inch margin around and below the mold spot because mold doesn't easily penetrate dense, low-moisture hard cheese due to its compact structure. However, soft cheeses like cream cheese, cottage cheese, and ricotta, plus shredded cheese of any kind, and porous foods like bread should be discarded entirely because mold threads penetrate throughout the food rapidly due to higher moisture content and porous structure. The 1963 habit of never checking expiration dates wasn't rebellion against modern labeling systems or stubborn refusal to follow guidelines. It was standard practice when expiration dates didn't exist on most foods or were rare and inconsistent across different products and manufacturers, and grandmothers determined food safety entirely by smell, appearance, and sometimes cautious taste, without any date reference printed on packaging to guide their decisions. The sound was refrigerator containers being opened and immediately sniffed before any decision was made about using or discarding the contents. The taste was small, cautious test bites of leftovers that had been in the refrigerator for several days to determine if they were still good or had started to spoil. The appearance was careful visual inspection for any mold growth, discoloration that indicated bacterial growth, or slimy texture that meant the food had gone bad. This habit required only sensory evaluation skills and decades of accumulated experience determining food safety by smell, appearance, and taste, plus the deeply held belief that human nose and eyes were reliable food safety detectors that had successfully kept humans safe for thousands of years before printed expiration dates were invented in the 1970s. You couldn't rely on printed dates. They weren't required by law on most foods yet, and when they did exist on some products, they seemed arbitrary and wasteful, designed to make people throw away perfectly good food so they'd buy more. You couldn't throw away food that smelled fine and looked normal just because some printed date had passed. That was wasteful when food cost money and your grandmother had lived through the Depression when wasting any food was unthinkable. What it meant? The smell test, appearance check, and sometimes small taste test determined whether food was safe to eat, not arbitrary dates printed on packages by manufacturers who had financial incentive to make people throw away food and buy replacements more frequently. Modern food safety guidelines say that sell-by, use-by, and best-by dates provide useful guidance for consumers, though food scientists acknowledge they're usually indicators of peak quality rather than safety cutoffs, and many foods remain safe beyond printed dates if stored properly. However, many dangerous pathogens, including listeria, salmonella, and pathogenic E. coli strains, have no smell, taste, or visible appearance, changes even when present at dangerous levels. So the traditional smell test isn't reliable for detecting dangerous bacterial contamination that can cause serious illness. But grandparents still ignore expiration dates completely and rely only on sensory evaluation methods they've trusted for 60 years, confidently insisting, if it smells okay and looks okay, it's perfectly fine to eat, not understanding that many dangerous bacteria are completely undetectable by human senses without laboratory testing, and that people can get seriously ill from food that smelled normal, looked normal, and tasted normal, but harbored invisible pathogens. The 1966 habit of pressure. Canning without following tested recipes wasn't negligence or ignorance. It was creativity and confidence when grandmothers across rural America used pressure canners but made up their own recipes based on what they had available, adjusted processing times based on intuition and decades of experience rather than scientific guidelines, combined ingredients freely without consulting charts, and canned combination foods like stews and soups without following USDA-tested recipes or official guidelines that most rural households didn't have access to anyway. Arkansas kitchens had grandmothers pressure canning beef stew with chunks of meat, potatoes, carrots, onions, and thick gravy using processing times. They estimated based on vaguely similar recipes they'd heard about from neighbors or read in outdated canning booklets, creating their own unique vegetable soup combinations based on what was ripe in the garden that week, and guessing at safe processing times based on whichever ingredient they thought was the densest or most likely to harbor bacteria. The sound was the pressure canner hissing steam and rocking rhythmically on the stovetop for however long Grandma thought was sufficient. The smell was beef and vegetables cooking under 15 pounds of pressure, filling the kitchen with savory aromas. The appearance was rows of beautiful glass jars filled with homemade stew and soup arranged proudly on pantry shelves. Looking identical to safely processed jars, but potentially containing botulism spores that could germinate during storage and produce deadly toxin. This habit required only a pressure canner that cost about $30, confidence in personal judgment developed over years of canning experience, and the deeply held belief that if the jars sealed properly with that satisfying ping sound when the lid sucked down tight, The food was safely preserved regardless of what ingredients were in the jar or exactly how long it had been processed. You couldn't follow recipes exactly from books. Experienced canners adjusted recipes constantly based on personal taste preferences and whatever ingredients were available from the garden or on sale at the store. You couldn't worry obsessively about precise processing times and pressures for every possible ingredient combination. General guidelines and common sense were considered enough. You couldn't limit yourself to only the specific combinations approved in official guidelines. That seemed unnecessarily restrictive when you had decades of experience. What it meant, pressure canning was seen as creative freedom to preserve whatever combinations you wanted for your family's taste preferences, not strict adherence to recipe. Following that limited your options and treated you like you didn't know what you were doing after canning for 40 years. Modern food safety experts and USDA guidelines require following tested recipes exactly for pressure canning, adjusting ingredients, changing proportions, substituting vegetables, or estimating processing times based on experience rather than science, can create unsafe products where botulism spores survive in the low-acid, oxygen-free environment inside sealed jars. But some grandparents still pressure can, using their own invented recipes and estimated times they've developed over decades. It proves they've been lucky, and that luck could run out with the next batch. These 30 habits weren't dangerous mistakes. They were Grandma's trusted skills developed over decades, methods her mother taught her and her grandmother before that. Modern food safety calls them risky. Grandparents call them experience. What scientists say is unsafe, they've done for 60 years without anyone getting sick.